ended a man's reputation, forced an entire school to reconsider its teachings, and became the legend that made Hollywood believe a 135-pound martial artist could move faster than a camera could capture. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1964. Bruce Lee was teaching a private class at his Jun Fan Gung Fu Institute in Oakland when one of his senior students brought it to him. The paper was formal. The handwriting, traditional Chinese calligraphy. Lee set down the wooden dummy arm he'd been demonstrating on and read it without expression. His students watched his face. It didn't change. The letter was a challenge, not the first Lee had received, but the first written with this much formality. The sender was Wong Jack Man, a Kung Fu instructor recently arrived from Hong Kong, trained in northern Shaolin and connected to the Chinese martial arts community in San Francisco's Chinatown. His credentials were legitimate, his reputation established. But the letter wasn't just from him. It carried the weight of traditionalists who viewed Bruce Lee as something dangerous. Lee had been teaching non-Chinese students. He'd been modifying classical techniques. He'd been saying publicly that traditional kung fu was too rigid, too ceremonial, too slow for real combat. To men who had spent decades preserving these methods, this wasn't innovation, it was betrayal. Wong Jack Man's challenge was an attempt to correct that. Lee folded the letter and placed it on the windowsill. He said nothing for a long moment. His students knew better than to ask. When Lee was quiet, he was thinking in a language that had no words, measuring angles, distances, possibilities. Finally, he spoke. Tell him yes. One of his students, James Lee, asked the question everyone was thinking. You want witnesses? Bruce nodded. Only witnesses. No reporters? No cameras? James frowned. Why? If you win, wouldn't you want proof? Lee looked at him with the kind of patience a teacher reserves for a student who hasn't yet understood the lesson. Because this isn't about proof, Lee said. It's about teaching. He turned back to the wooden dummy and resumed his drill. The conversation was over. Over the next few days, word spread quietly through the Bay Area martial arts community. The traditionalists saw it as a reckoning. Lee's students saw it as a formality, a chance for their teacher to demonstrate what they already knew. But Lee himself treated it like any other training day. He didn't increase his workout. He didn't speak about strategy. He simply continued refining what he always refined: efficiency. One evening, a student asked him what he planned to do during the match. Lee's answer was almost casual. I'll show him one technique, he said. If he understands it, the match will be short. If he doesn't, the match will be shorter. The student didn't ask what he meant. Lee had a way of speaking that sounded simple, until you tried to unpack it later alone and realized how much you'd missed. On the day before the match, Lee set one final condition through an intermediary: the fight would take place at his school, in his space, with his students present. Wong Jack Man agreed. He had his own students. He had his tradition. He believed, as many did, that Bruce Lee's modifications were shortcuts, clever, perhaps, but not rooted in true mastery. He would learn otherwise. The stage was set. The room would be small, the audience select, and the lesson, though no one knew it yet, would be taught in less time than it takes to exhale. They arrived exactly on time. Wong Jack Man entered through the front door of the Junfan Institute with 5 men behind him. He wore a traditional Chinese martial arts uniform, dark, pressed, formal. His posture was upright. His expression, neutral. He moved like a man who had been told all his life that his presence alone carried authority. Bruce Lee's students were already there, standing along the walls. The space was narrow, a converted garage with hardwood floors, a few wooden dummies in the corner, and a single window letting in grey afternoon light. It wasn't a grand arena. It wasn't meant to be. Wong's group took their place on one side of the room. Lee's students remained on the other. No one sat. No one spoke. The air was still in the way it gets before something irreversible happens. James Lee stood near the door, arms folded. He had tried one last time that morning to talk Bruce out of it, not because he doubted him, but because he knew what a public loss could do to a school this small, this new. Bruce had only smiled and said, "There won't be a loss." Now, watching Wong Jack Man's students size up the room with quiet confidence, James wasn't sure if that was wisdom or stubbornness. Minutes passed. No one moved. Then Bruce Lee entered from the back room. He was smaller than Wong had expected. 5'7", 135 pounds. He wore a simple black t-shirt and loose training pants. No uniform. No ceremony. He moved across the floor without sound, his steps economical, his shoulders loose. He stopped 3 feet from Wong Jack Man and bowed. Wong did not return it immediately. He studied Lee's face as if trying to locate the arrogance he'd been told about, the disrespect. But Lee's expression gave him nothing. It wasn't humble. It wasn't proud. It was simply attentive. After a long pause, Wong bowed. Stiffly. His students followed. "You've come a long way," Lee said in Cantonese. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "Tradition travels." Wong replied, "Even when it's inconvenient." Lee nodded as if the words were reasonable. "Then let's not waste your time." He gestured toward the center of the room. Wong moved into position. Lee did the same. There was no referee, no bell, no countdown, just 2 men standing 12 feet apart in a space that suddenly felt much smaller. One of Wong's students whispered something. Wong silenced him with a glance. Lee rolled his shoulders once, loosening them. Then he raised one hand, palm open. "Before we begin," he said, "I'd like to show you something." Wong frowned. "A technique. A measurement," Lee said. Without waiting for a response, Lee shifted his weight onto his back leg and extended his front foot in a slow, controlled side kick. Not toward Wong, just into the air. His knee chambered, his hip rotated, his foot snapped out, hung in space for half a second, then retracted. It was textbook clean. Nothing flashy, nothing aggressive. Wong watched with the expression of a man who had seen 1,000 kicks and found this one unremarkable. "Is that all?" Wong asked. Lee lowered his leg and settled back into stance. His face didn't change. "That's enough." Wong's students exchanged glances. One of them almost smiled. They didn't understand what had just happened. Lee hadn't been showing off. He'd been measuring distance, calibrating, setting the terms of what would come next. Wong assumed his own stance, traditional, rooted, formal. "I'm ready," he said. Lee nodded. "So am I." There are moments in combat where everything compresses, not into chaos, but into clarity. This was one of them. Wong Jack Man stood in a classical stance, weight distributed evenly, hands positioned in a northern Shaolin guard, shoulders squared. It was a posture built over centuries, refined by masters who believed that form was the foundation of all power. His breathing was controlled, his gaze fixed. Bruce Lee stood differently. His weight was on his rear leg. His lead foot pointed forward, light, ready to move in any direction. His hands were low, open, almost casual. To someone trained in traditional methods, it looked incomplete, like a man who hadn't finished preparing. But Lee was already 3 moves ahead. He had studied Wong's stance the moment he'd taken it. The weight distribution, the shoulder angle, the tension in the lead hand. Every detail was information, and information was opportunity. "Whenever you're ready," Lee said quietly. Wong didn't move immediately. He was waiting for Lee to commit first, to reveal his strategy. It was a patience taught by tradition. Let your opponent expose himself, then counter with superior form. Lee understood this. He'd been raised in the same tradition. He'd spent years learning to wait, to respond, to flow. But he'd also spent years unlearning it, stripping away the parts that were ceremony, keeping only what worked when there was no time to think. He took one small step forward. Wong reacted instantly, shifting his weight, raising his guard. Lee stopped. The step had been a test. Wong had responded exactly as his training dictated. Defend the center line, maintain structure, prepare to counter. Lee made a mental note. Then he spoke. "You've trained a long time," Lee said. It wasn't flattery. It was observation. 20 years, Wong replied. Lee nodded. "It shows." For a moment, something softened in Wong's expression, not pride, but acknowledgement. He had dedicated his life to this. Every morning drill, every repeated form, every correction from his own teachers. It wasn't just technique, it was identity. Lee understood that too. Which was why what he was about to do would hurt in a way no punch could. He shifted his weight again, this time settling into a stance that looked deceptively passive. His hands dropped slightly. His shoulders relaxed. To Wong's students, it looked like Lee was lowering his guard. It wasn't a lowered guard, it was an invitation. Wong saw the opening. His training told him to take it. His instinct told him to wait. Instinct lost. He stepped forward with a straight punch, fast, technically clean, aimed at Lee's center line. Lee didn't block it. He moved. Not backward, not to the side, forward and slightly offline, just enough to make Wong's punch pass through empty space. At the same instant, Lee's rear leg chambered, and his body rotated. The exact motion he'd demonstrated moments earlier, the one Wong had dismissed as unremarkable. But this time it wasn't slow. Lee's foot shot out in a side kick that covered the distance between them faster than Wong's brain could process. It stopped 1 inch from Wong's chest. Perfectly controlled. Perfectly placed. Wong froze. Lee held the position for 2 seconds, long enough for everyone in the room to see it, to understand what had just happened. Then he retracted his leg and stepped back. The room was silent. Wong's punch was still extended in the air, his weight committed forward, his stance broken. He hadn't been hit, but he'd been touched by something worse. The realization that Lee could have ended it in that moment and chose not to. Lee reset his stance. His expression hadn't changed. Again, he asked. Wong's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, because now he understood. The demonstration wasn't a technique, it was a warning. Wong Jackman stepped back and reset his stance. His breathing had changed. Not labored, just sharper, more deliberate. He was recalculating. The opening he'd seen hadn't been an opening. It had been bait, and he'd taken it exactly as Lee had predicted. But Wong was not a novice. 20 years of training had taught him to adapt, to read an opponent's rhythm and disrupt it. He adjusted his guard, lowered his center of gravity, and began moving laterally. If Lee was faster in a straight line, Wong would force him to chase angles. Lee didn't chase. He simply pivoted in place, his lead foot adjusting like a compass needle, always pointing at Wong's center line. No wasted motion, no anticipation, just response. Wong feinted left. Lee didn't react. Wong feinted right. Lee's weight shifted a 1/4 inch. That was all. It was unnerving. Most fighters gave something away, a tensing of the shoulders, a flicker in the eyes, a weight shift that telegraphed intention. Lee gave nothing. He was present but empty. Like water waiting for a shape to fill, Wong's students watched in silence. They had seen their teacher spar dozens of times. They had never seen him look uncertain. One of Lee's students leaned toward James and whispered, "Why isn't Bruce attacking?" James didn't take his eyes off the match. He already did. Wong decided to force the issue. He launched a combination, low kick to destabilize, straight punch to close distance, follow-up strike to overwhelm. It was a sequence drilled into muscle memory, executed with precision. Lee intercepted it at the root. The moment Wong's weight shifted for the low kick, Lee's rear leg chambered. There was no wind-up, no preparation. Just an instantaneous transfer of energy from stillness into motion. The side kick hit Wong in the chest. Not with full power. Lee had controlled it, the same way he'd controlled the demonstration. But this time the impact was real. Wong felt his lungs compress. His balance broke. His feet left the ground. He was airborne for less than a second. When he landed 3 feet back, he didn't fall. His body caught itself instinctively, years of conditioning keeping him upright. But his mind was somewhere else, still trying to process how the distance had closed, how the kick had arrived before his punch, how something that fast could exist. The room held its breath. Wong stood there, chest heaving, staring at Lee with an expression that wasn't anger or fear. It was recognition. The kind that comes when you've spent your entire life believing you understood something, only to discover you'd been studying a reflection. Lee lowered his leg and returned to a neutral stance. He didn't advance. He didn't speak. He simply waited. Wong's hands were still raised, but the structure was gone. His guard had become a formality, a gesture without belief behind it. 3 seconds had passed since the match began. Wong looked at his students. Then at Lee's. Then at the floor. He straightened slowly, his breathing steadying. His hands dropped to his sides. For a long moment, no one was sure if he would continue or concede. Then he bowed. Not the stiff, ceremonial bow from before. Something deeper. Something that acknowledged not just defeat, but education. Lee returned the bow immediately, with the same depth. "Thank you for coming," Lee said quietly. Wong said nothing. He turned and walked toward the door. His students hesitated, glancing at each other, then followed. No one shook hands. No one spoke. The only sound was the door closing behind them. James exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. "That's it?" one of Lee's students asked. Lee was already walking toward the wooden dummy in the corner. "That's it," he said. For 10 seconds after the door closed, no one moved. Bruce Lee's students stood along the walls, still processing what they'd witnessed. It hadn't been a fight. Not in the way they understood fights. No back and forth exchange, no gradual escalation, no dramatic finish. Just a question asked and answered in the span of a single breath. James Lee finally broke the silence. "Should someone go after them?" Bruce shook his head. He was adjusting the wooden dummy, checking its bolts, his hands moving with the same calm efficiency they always did. "They need time." Time for what? To decide what they saw. One of the younger students, Linda, who would later become Bruce's wife, stepped forward. "What did they see?" Bruce stopped and looked at her. His expression was thoughtful, the way it always was when a question deserved more than a surface answer. "They saw their teacher lose," he said. "But more than that, they saw him realize he'd been training for the wrong fight." He turned back to the dummy and struck it once, a sharp, snapping punch that rattled the wooden arms. Wong Jack Man is a good martial artist. Technically excellent. But he spent 20 years perfecting answers to questions no one's asking anymore. "And you?" Linda asked. Bruce smiled slightly. "I spent 20 years learning to ask better questions." Outside, Wong Jack Man walked 3 blocks before stopping. His students caught up to him, unsure whether to speak. The silence between them was heavier than any conversation. One of the younger ones, David, finally ventured a question. "Sifu, what happened in there?" Wong didn't answer immediately. He stood at the corner, staring at the intersection, watching cars pass. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I was taught that structure defeats chaos," he said. "That form is the foundation, that if you perfect the technique, speed and power follow naturally." He paused. "I was wrong." David frowned. "But you've won dozens of matches against people who believed the same things I did." Wong interrupted. His tone wasn't bitter, just factual. "Bruce Lee doesn't fight the way we were taught to fight. He doesn't wait for openings. He creates them. He doesn't respond to your attack. He responds to the thought before your attack." Another student, older, spoke up. "Then he's abandoned tradition." Wong turned to look at him. "No. He's understood it better than we have." The student looked confused. Wong continued. "Our teachers taught us that water adapts to any container. We memorized that lesson. We repeated it in forms. But we never became it. We just poured ourselves into the container of tradition and stayed there." He looked back toward the direction of Lee's school. "He became the water." The group stood in silence. "So what do we do now?" David asked. Wong exhaled slowly. "We train differently, or we keep losing to people who already have." Back at the institute, Bruce Lee's students were asking their own questions. "Why didn't you hit him harder?" one asked. "You could have knocked him out." Bruce was stretching now, methodical, his mind already moving past the match. "Because that wasn't the point." "Then what was?" Bruce looked at him. "If I'd knocked him out, he would have gone home thinking he lost because I was stronger or faster. He would have trained harder in the same style and come back. But now," he paused. "No, he's going home wondering if everything he knows is incomplete. That's a much more valuable lesson." James nodded slowly. "You didn't just beat him. You made him question himself." "No," Bruce corrected. "I made him question his method. There's a difference." He stood and rolled his shoulders. "The match was 3 seconds. The lesson will take years." He was right. The story didn't spread the way stories usually do. Loud, exaggerated, passed from bar to dojo with each retelling adding another impossible detail. It spread quietly. Wong Jack Man never spoke about the match publicly, but in the months that followed, students at his school noticed changes. The rigid adherence to classical forms softened. Sparring sessions became less choreographed, more improvisational. Wong began asking different questions during training. What if your opponent doesn't move the way you expect? What if speed matters more than structure? What if tradition isn't the answer, just the starting point? One of his senior students eventually asked him directly, "Are we abandoning what our masters taught us?" Wong's answer was careful, "No, we're completing it." He never mentioned Bruce Lee by name. He didn't have to. Everyone understood what had changed him. Word reached other schools. Not through Wong, but through the students who had witnessed the match. They told training partners. Those partners told their instructors. The details varied. Some said the match lasted 5 seconds, others said 10, but the essential truth remained consistent. Bruce Lee had ended it with a single technique, demonstrated in advance, delivered with precision that made defense irrelevant. The traditional martial arts community in San Francisco split quietly into two camps. One dismissed the story as exaggeration, another American shortcut. The other began visiting Lee's school, not to challenge him, but to understand what they'd missed. Lee didn't gloat. He didn't market the victory. He simply continued teaching, refining, questioning. The match had proven something to him as well, not that he was superior, but that speed without technique was chaos, and technique without speed was performance art. The gap between the two had to close. He trained harder. 2 years later, a film producer named William Dozier heard the story third-hand at a Hollywood party. Someone mentioned a martial artist in Oakland who could punch faster than a camera's frame rate. Dozier was skeptical. He'd seen plenty of martial arts demonstrations, choreographed, theatrical, impressive but ultimately controlled. He flew to Oakland to meet Lee. "Show me," Dozier said. Lee performed the same side kick he'd shown Wong Jack Man. Then he did it again at full speed. Dozier blinked. "Do that again." Lee repeated it. "I didn't see it," Dozier admitted. "Exactly," Lee said. That conversation became a screen test. The screen test became the Green Hornet. The Green Hornet became international attention. And the international attention became film offers that would, within a decade, make Bruce Lee the most famous martial artist in the world. But the foundation, the moment that made Hollywood believe a 135-pound man could move faster than physics seemed to allow, was built on 3 seconds in a converted garage in Oakland. Wong Jack Man continued teaching until his death in 2005. In interviews late in his life, he was occasionally asked about Bruce Lee. He always answered the same way, respectfully, briefly, without detail. When pressed about the match specifically, he would say only, "It was a learning experience." He never clarified who had learned. Bruce Lee's students, however, told the story often. Not as a boast, but as a teaching tool. James Lee would use it to explain economy of motion. Linda Lee would reference it when discussing Bruce's philosophy of adaptation. Dan Inosanto would break down the mechanics in seminars, showing how the side kick wasn't about power, it was about intercepting intention before it became action. The match itself had lasted 3 seconds. The lesson has lasted 60 years, and in dojos across the world, when students ask how Bruce Lee became Bruce Lee, instructors still begin the same way. There was a challenge in 1964. The details vary. The truth remains. Not because Bruce Lee won a fight, but because he demonstrated something that couldn't be argued with, couldn't be dismissed, and couldn't be forgotten. He moved at the speed of certainty, and certainty, once witnessed, becomes legend.